Welcome to our presentation for Journalism 313. Today, Jessie and I are going to be analysing a podcast by 99% Invisible called The Pool and the Stream. The podcast follows skateboarders in California and how the rise of skateboarding led to changes within architecture in both America and Europe. The structural techniques used within the podcast are shown very obviously. They used a 3-act structure, and throughout the podcast they explain when it is the next section.
It's a story in 3 parts by producer Avery Trufelman. Part 1, California.
This looks pretty fun.
History. Part 2, Sonoma. Part 3, Finland. Avery Trufelman actually went to Finland.
Part 1 is called California and sets the scene of the skateboarders and how the trend became so popular within the 70s. Part 2 is Sonoma. This is where the rising action starts. The audience begins feeling a sense that this podcast is not just about skateboarding. This part begins connecting the skateboarding trend with the empty kidney-shaped pools. There is also a confrontation with the law and the skateboarders. The last part is called Finland. This is where the crisis happens, and then we have the falling action. Everything begins making sense in this section. We start to fully understand what the podcast is about and make the connection between skateboarding and architecture. I think that this structure works well for the podcast. There is a clear narrative of how the skateboarding trend started and what it has contributed to being with the architecture.
This was clearly a well thought out and presented feature-style podcast narrated by Avery Trufelman. As mentioned earlier by Serena, this is a 3-part piece which is completely scripted. This allows for the audience to get an in-depth understanding of the history of skateboarding and architecture and how they intrinsically intertwined to tell a beautiful story. Without this full script, this podcast wouldn't be as successful as it was, as it wouldn't have the structure that is necessary to tell this story. This non-fiction piece never has a dull moment. Throughout the entire piece, it is never just Avery speaking for more than 20 seconds at a time. She incorporates music, atmos, and well-picked-out quotes to keep the piece steadily moving and extremely vibrant.
Skateboarders appreciate the small details of architecture more than anyone. They recognize the quality of concrete, the grain of wood, the incline of a structure. They recognize the way a landscape flows.
Like going up a vertical wall, weightlessness is pretty extraordinary.
Skateboarding became a form of choreography, where you're trying to do as much as possible in the limited space of the pool, and look graceful while doing it.
Here we were, a bunch of scruffy kids, and here we are riding in backyard pools, and we know what we're doing is beautiful, and we get to feel beautiful.
The production techniques used within the podcast make the podcast its most interesting. The biggest thing from the podcast is we hear from multiple voices throughout. I have listed all the voices we hear within the slides. All these people add their own important points to the podcast. Personally, I think for myself, the most prominent person they interview is Jake Phelps, who's the editor at Thrasher magazine. Even though he doesn't speak much, every time I hear his voice come on, I knew exactly who it was. His passion for skateboarding really comes through when he speaks. He also has a very laid-back energy. He also kind of made me laugh a little bit with some of the stuff he says, and I think he added a whole other layer to the podcast that it really needed. All the skateboarders they interview add their own flair and really immerse you into their culture.
My name is Jake Phelps. I'm the editor of Thrasher magazine from San Francisco, California, born and raised. Yeah, what do you got? I'm a skater. I dress like a skater. These are the costumes I've been running all of my life. I don't wear fucking Louis Vuitton clothes and shit. I mean, I wear sneakers. That's, that's just the way it is. We're utilitarian. We skate.
Another technique used in the podcast is music. It is used multiple times. First, we have using it as a spacer between sections. It is sometimes drawn out to make way for the next section.
But it might be the most famous private backyard in 20th century American history. Part 2. Sonoma.
Music is also used to enhance the mood. There are some sections when we have an upbeat music, which adds to the excitement or thrill of the skating. I also found the overall audio of the interviews and narrative to be very crisp. It's obvious that they used quite good microphones and a good setup. The last production technique that we have is sound effects. We hear lots of atmos through the podcast, which just enhances the narrative. Probably my favourite area where this happens is the pool splash. It also happens on multiple occasions with the skateboarding sounds or just their chatter.
Los Angeles was theirs to claim.
And so that meant schoolyards, that meant in garages, city buildings, it was any place. Anything was rideable. But none of this was designed for us.
3 small dogs rush out to meet Avery Trufelman.
Hi!
So you got a little lost.
I know, because I tried it.
This podcast has a lot of strengths, and overall I found myself really enjoying listening to it. I learnt a lot about skateboarding which I had no idea prior to this. Another strength was its detail in descriptions. You didn't need to know anything about skateboarding or architecture before listening to this. An example is how they describe the wheels.
Then in the early 70s, an invention comes along that would revolutionize skateboarding. The urethane wheel. This soft plastic wheel had more give to it and held the ground, unlike those clunky, dangerous clay wheels that preceded it. These soft wheels were intended for roller skaters at the dawn of the roller disco era, but a small company called Creative Urethanes began producing urethane wheels specifically for skateboards.
As I said in the previous slide, there was a great use of atmos. It wasn't too much that you felt overwhelmed, and it was just enough to feel immersed in the narrative. The background music also came in at good levels. It wasn't too loud that I felt myself hard of hearing the story, and there were also times that it was just silent and it was only talking. It was a good balance. Overall, I think the podcast creators had a clear vision when it came to creating this. They spoke to the right people and structured the story in a way that everyone could understand it. I would recommend this podcast to anyone, even if they have no interest in these topics. It is a good listen.
In all honesty, it was rather difficult to find a major weakness in this piece. I really enjoyed this piece, and I've now gone on and listened to a couple more of 99%'s works, and they're all really great. However, this is a rather fast-paced podcast, and in order to keep the audience's attention, sometimes, not very frequently, the editing of quotes and scripting can end quite abruptly. In a couple of scenarios, this made me lost for a brief second, but due to the well scripting and the use of music and atmos, I knew exactly where I was again. Here is an example from the first part of the piece.
At that point, every kid in America and all over the world wanted to get inside a swimming pool. That was it. That was the Holy Grail. And so the drought really acted as a wonderful midwife to the skateboarding revolution.
Eventually, Stacy and the other skateboarders got so good at pool skating, they were able to skate up over the edge of the pool. They could kind of jump up in the air and maybe do a spin or something before dropping back into the pool. And these aerial tricks led to another genre of skateboarding.
So style became less important and extreme maneuvers became more important.
Aerial tricks paved the way for the X Games,
Both Serena and I came to the conclusion that it wasn't until the second part of the piece that I actually understood the purpose and true theme of the podcast. I was excited to listen to a piece about skateboarding and history of it, and then I got slightly confused by talking of a kidney-shaped pool. Yet the second part was very well written and allowed me to see it as a bridging section between skateboarding and architecture. I will add, the first time I listened to the piece, I didn't read a brief about it because I really wanted to just listen to the piece. And that's probably where my confusion came from. I do believe that it is important to add that neither of these actually take away from the piece, as it was only on my second listen that I even noticed the editing of some of the quotes, as I was purposely looking for something. And in all honesty, not knowing the direction of the piece genuinely made me curious about where it was heading. I think I even listened better because of this. This piece was very well thought out and it is extremely coherent as it constantly refers back to previous parts and previous mentioned topics and themes. Even though I was lost coming in listening blind, everything was still extremely clear. The information was there, it was delivered in an easy to listen way, and it made me curious about the direction of the piece. The part that's, really stuck with me and had an impact about the relationship between architecture and skateboarding.
Just don't know.
There's no way to verify it, but that's the story architects tell. If there's a book about the Donnell Garden, it's probably going to have a mention of the Villa Mairea. Some say that Alvar Aalto's pool at the Villa Mairea was inspired by the soft bends in a Finnish lake. Or maybe Aalto was just excited about his ability to make wavy forms, since that kind of became his signature in his furniture and homewares. Or who knows, maybe he was inspired by some other curvy pool somewhere else in the world that we don't know about. Aalto didn't like to talk about his inspiration. He didn't write too much about it either. Aalto only talked about the birth of his ideas in an extended metaphor about a fish in a stream.
It's important for me to mention the beginning and ending quote by Aalto that ties together. It is a great aha moment, and this extended metaphor really wrapped up the piece in an awesome way, which I really loved. I kind of wish people did this more often. This piece was very impactful for me. As a beginner skateboarder, I am still left thinking about the architecture of skateboarding and the importance that they have for each other. It's important to add that I'm not the only one pleased with this piece and how standout it is. There is a full Reddit page that's dedicated to this podcast and everyone loved it. User Clairvoyant Truth said that this may be the best 99% episode I've heard. It is a beauty of a story and design while challenging the perspective on reality. And I completely agree with that. This is a piece that I wouldn't choose to listen to, but I feel like I've learnt so much from listening to it. These are just our references. Obviously we had the actual podcast as our first reference, but the others are really just what goes into making a podcast as well as the acts of the podcast. We did a bit of looking into how to make a good podcast to be able to understand whether or not this was a good podcast. And both Serena and I come to the conclusion that this is a great podcast and I'm going to recommend it to anyone and everyone. And I've also started listening to a bunch of 99% stories. So, yeah. Thank you.